Neuropsychiatric disabilities, or neuropsykiatriska funktionshinder as they're called in Swedish, are big business in Sweden. Big government business, that is. No less than 40 billion Swedish crowns, or over 1% of GDP, is spent on something called LSS, special support for certain disabilities, mostly consisting of people on the autistic spectrum. 60,000 out of Sweden's population of 9.2 million people are in this program. Per person, this is a cost of about 700,000 crowns a year, or almost $100,000. For comparison, the costs for autism in the USA are $35 billion a year, and that includes medical costs, which the Swedish program doesn't. This is only 0.3% of GDP, or a quarter of what Sweden spends. Clearly, wasteful government spending has an impact on how much something costs. And whereas in Sweden, diagnosed individuals are generally confined to being more or less wards of the state, in the USA, there are many people with these neurological differences who work high-paying jobs. A person that costs $100,000 a year under a government program in Sweden due to unnecessary intervention might instead earn the same amount in the USA. A man who more than any other has established a negative view of these subjective disabilities is Christopher Gillberg. Since the late 1970s, he said school employees diagnosed children with these labels and campaigned for interventions. He even attempted to introduce a diagnostic label of his own called DAMP, or DAMP, but it got very little international recognition and has been abandoned even in Sweden today. When other researchers wanted to see his data since they were skeptical of his conclusions, he ended up destroying all the research data in what became the greatest research scandal in Swedish history. Most likely he had his co-workers destroy it to hide how unsupported these conclusions were and that his research was just fraudulent. If his research holds the same level as his campaigning, then it's understandable why he destroyed the data.
Tyvärr visar ju många studier att barn med ADHD, om de inte får diagnos och förståelse på rätt sätt i skolan, så går de ut skolan med mindre kunskaper, till och med i vissa ämnen, än vad de hade när de började.
I wish he'd explained to me just how education can take away knowledge from pupils. I can give him one thing. If pupils had him as their teacher, I'm sure they would walk away with less correct knowledge than they had when they started, whether they have ADHD or not. In 1997, he published a very embarrassing article in one of Sweden's largest newspapers, Dagens Nyheter. In it, he argues that society needs to do more to diagnose and intervene in the lives of these children. He doesn't present a picture of these so-called disorders that's supported by science, however, and his choice of words is terrible for someone who will almost dictate policy. A medical diagnosis that makes normal learning in large classes impossible. But for all of these children, 120,000 Swedish children between 3 and 18 years old, every day that they're not seen with the right eyes is one during which their self-esteem is shattered. Asperger's syndrome occurs in roughly 0.5% of all children. This group of children doesn't stand a chance if their disability isn't recognized. To be able to develop in spite of their disability, many are dependent on a personal assistant or other individual helper who can teach them and train them in social interplay and help them towards interests that are harmless and so that compulsive acts don't become too destructive. Children with DAMP, ADHD, Asperger's and Tourette's also in at least half the cases have dyslexia as well. They are lifelong disabilities that if they aren't recognized, become diagnosed, and if the sufferers don't get adequate help, makes a positive development impossible. If these children aren't seen and their disabilities diagnosed, they don't stand a chance in everyday school life. This is in spite of many people feeling that, for example, very successful businessman Bill Gates matches the criteria for Asperger's syndrome. These next two clips are other doctors that have influenced policy in the country.
Och det är ju mycket som säger att pannloben är lite underutvecklad hos personer med en ADHD-problematik. Och det är ju så att de här anses ju vuxna då när de är 20 år, men många gånger har de en mognad som motsvarar en 13-åring. Och hur ofta bestämmer man att en 13-åring har full beslutsrätt över sitt liv?
Kan man då inte som socialsekreterare i det mötet någonting om ADHD, så tänker man, ja men han påstår att han har fått en diagnos ADHD, det kan inte stämma. Och så drar man sina egna slutsatser. Man möter inte människan med ett funktionshindertänkande utan snarare med ett moralistiskt tänkande.
If you've been given any of these diagnostic labels, you face very real discrimination by the government. The unemployment office won't bother trying to help you get a real job. The social services might show a keen interest in putting your children in foster care, and the procedure to get a driving license will be even longer than it already is. This reads, if you got a diagnosis like for example ADHD, DAMP or Asperger's syndrome, in most cases there isn't any problem getting a learner permit, but it's required that you produce a doctor's certificate showing how serious the condition is. Hence, your right to a driving license is in the hands of your doctor if you've been diagnosed with these conditions. If the doctor decides you're not fit to get a license, you're cooked, no matter how good a driver you are. This goes if you have to reapply for a license as well.